Kia ora, and welcome to Upper Hutt City Library's Little Podcast. I'm your host Simon, and together we're going to have a look at what your librarians and other people who work in the library get up to every day. Thanks for joining me, Gail. It's really hard to get people who just like to work at their desk to come out. So I ambushed Gail this morning and didn't tell her what we were doing.
Oh, no problem, Simon.
So let's just start with what's your job at the library?
I'm the Access and Content Team Leader, so my team looks after the library resources, the books and DVDs, magazines, newspapers, plus we look after our heritage area and digital services.
Quite a bit then.
Yes.
Yeah, so pretty much all of the stuff that you get out from the library, your team selected or
yes,
kind of...
that's right. Yes, yeah.
So we've actually had a few questions about this, mainly around how do you choose what we get?
We have a philosophy in our library of buying what people want to read. So we very much look at what is popular and what goes out. We try to have as little what we call dead stock, which is books or any resources that sit on the shelf never going out as possible. So everything we do, it's about what do people want, and that's what we buy.
Things have changed a little bit, right, with buying. Like back when you started, I'm guessing you bought everything, right? Yeah,
so back when I started, we used to have all our vendors would come to the library with books and boxes, and they'd have their monthly appointment and they'd pull out all the books and you'd feel them and look at them, and then you'd have another vendor coming the next day, whereas these days we buy everything online, so we don't buy anything face to face anymore. So that's been a really big change.
Yeah, and is there stuff, I know some libraries they have some things bought for them, or you just get shipments of books from overseas. So do we just get books?
So some of our book, a lot of our fiction is selected for us by our Australian firm that we deal with, though a lot of our books are actually chosen by a staff member.
Right. Yeah.
So
is it common? I kind of get the feeling like overseas, especially in the States, it's quite common for almost all their buying to be selected externally.
Yes. So a lot of larger libraries would outsource their selection, but a lot of them still do like to have a staff member do it, because the belief is that we know our community and we know what our customers want to read. So somebody who might live in the States and be buying on our behalf, they don't have that knowledge. Mm-hmm. So it's far better if you can to do it with your existing staff who know the community, who work in the library and who are talking to the people who come in and know what's the best thing. So, and you do find that communities differ. So, it's what they would buy in Wellington Central Library with is predominantly working community might be very different to what we would buy, where we might have a lot more families, a lot more diverse community than they may have. Maybe wrong, but you do tend to find what can be really popular here may not be really popular somewhere else, or vice versa.
Do we have quite a specific plan here on where the collections are going and how they're growing, or do we really react? Are we quite flexible in reacting to what people want all the time? Yeah,
we do constantly look at what we're buying. So, for example, with our adult fiction, again, it's a good example. We know what are our popular authors, but there are new authors coming in all the time, and some of our popular authors suddenly become not popular. So you're constantly looking at what we're getting.
Yeah. So, Upper Hutt Library, especially the Popup library at the moment, it's not a big space. So, does that give you a lot of challenges, or how do you navigate it compared to a much larger library?
Well, it's interesting because while we've been in the Popup, we haven't let that affect our buying at all. We know that people still want to read. We don't want to miss out on what's popular. So we haven't cut back on what we've bought at all. So there may be a belief that we're spending less on books and that some of that money might be going towards the repairs at the central library, but that's not actually the case. Even when we move back to our central building, we want our buying to continue exactly the same. We want the new books to carry on coming in and everything to be business as usual, because we know that people don't stop reading just because you're now suddenly in a smaller building. What has happened is that we have a lot more books in storage. At the moment with the Popup, there are a lot more books in storage at Central, and we have a smaller collection in the Popup, and it will be good for people to be able to access those books that are in storage once we move back. But you know, everything pretty much carries on going.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting with a small space with more new books that we've had comments that are along the lines of, you know, oh, you have so many new books, it's looking so great, and that's just kind of because we have the newer books.
Yes, they
in
stand
a smaller
out.
space.
Yes,
so everything looks kind of fresher.
We found it very interesting that our large print actually is going out more in the pop-out than it did at Central, and so we've had discussions about whether that's because it's located in a better place, or is there another factor, but why are they going out better now than they did before? So that's a challenge for us, that when we move back, we carry on that usage.
Yeah. So do you want to explain to us what a stack is?
So we've always had a stack. Those are books that are a bit scruffy, and people still want to read them, but they're so scruffy we don't want to have them in amongst our collection, because you know, you want the collection to look fresh and clean. You don't want the really old, falling to pieces books sitting there. So if we can't buy a new copy, we put them out in our stack, so they're kept out in the workroom, and a staff member has to go and get them for the customer. But what you do find is that people can only access them by seeing them on the catalogue. They can't see them on the shelf. So sometimes you'll have books that have been sitting in our stack for years and never gone out. So you do have to constantly think about, are we wasting space keeping that stuff in the stack? And but I mean, there are always going to be books, especially in a science fiction or a fantasy series, where people definitely want to have book 3. We can't buy a new copy of book 3, so we will put it out in the stack rather than leave it on the shelf where it just looks ugly.
And probably like certain New Zealand authors and books like, you know.
So we did weed our stack quite significantly a couple of years ago, because we did find that there, as I was saying before, there are a lot of books here that hadn't been out for years and years, and we're only a smallish library or medium-sized library. We don't have massive amount of storage space, so we have to be a bit sensible. You know, it would be nice to be able to keep everything, but we just don't have the space to do that.
That brings me to another question, actually. Would you like to have a huge stack? Or would it be kind of like if you have a big garage, you just end up getting more stuff to fill it and it doesn't really get used? Or
Well, I do know that Masterton Library have a massive stack and it gets used really well. So I think there is an argument for having a good sized stack. And some libraries actually have their stack in the public space. They don't have it out the back where a staff member has to get it, and they find that they get used too. People just know that this is a little area here of some real scruffy old books, but they're still there and people want them. But we just have that challenge that we just can't because of our space. Yeah,
and it's I guess from my perspective, from my job, it's definitely a visibility issue.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah. People don't know it's there. And you can put a poster up, but who looks at a poster?
No,
you just want to pick a book off a shelf and go.
Yes.
Do we get a lot of suggestions to buy?
Yes, we do, and we love suggestions to buy. And this comes back to that philosophy I was talking about before about buying what our library users want. So if there is something that somebody really wants to read and we don't have it, we really want to hear about that. Because often if one person has asked for us to buy a book, we know that other people may read it as well. But unfortunately, a lot of the suggestion to buys we get, those books are now out of print and we cannot buy them. So that quite often happens. Or they're very, very expensive and, we've only got a certain amount of money. So you have to weigh up whether it's worth spending that much money on a book and how many people will actually want to read it. So yes, we do love suggestion to buys. Would always encourage anybody, if they see a book that they would really like to read and we don't have it, just let us know about that.
Yeah. And there's a form on our website that you can fill out.
Yes, and really a paper form. Either way, whichever suits you, you can go and talk to a staff member, you can do it at home. online, whichever's easiest.
Yeah, I found that I haven't done much buying, but I was quite surprised. I guess I never thought about how hard it can be for a place to source books. I'd buy everything in a series, but then number 3 would be out of print with the publisher.
Very frustrating.
Yeah, and as a borrower, I'd never even thought of that as a possibility. I always just thought, why does the library not have this book?
Yes.
But it can be a bit harder than that.
So occasionally we'll buy from Amazon, and for some reason you can sometimes get from them that you can't get from our main suppliers, but it's not always the cheapest option, so it would certainly not be our first choice to use Amazon, but it is a bit of a resource, but last resort.
Are you noticing any current trends?
Well, it's actually it's quite an interesting, because a few years ago everybody thought that the day of the physical book was gone and everybody was going to be reading ebooks. And everyone was saying, oh, you'll need smaller spaces for your books because everything's electronic. Yeah. But in reality, we've found that hasn't been the case, and that as time has gone by, people have gone back to the physical book. They just find, I think it's digital fatigue by the end of the day. They've been looking at a computer all day. They actually just want to hold a book, and people like the tactile experience of smelling it and touching it, and it's quite satisfying to actually turn a page, and you don't necessarily get that when you're reading off a tablet or an iPad or your phone. So I think that has been a surprise. So you're finding even now that a lot of the bookstores are growing, and there are new bookstores opening, so it's not just libraries, but that the world recognises that actually electronic is not necessarily people's first preference. So that's been an interesting thing to notice in the last few years.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't have, and I guess that's still public perception is still a little bit, libraries are, or books are on the way out, and they associate libraries with the books. But really you've got, I only really read paper books or physical books. My partner, Ebooks.
Yes.
Audiobooks, actually. She pretty much just listens to audiobook. My dad just reads ebook, and that's kind of 3 different markets.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think if you people travel a lot, an ebook is actually quite handy. Less room in your suitcase or your handbag. But that actually is interesting. You should say that with the audiobooks, that's actually another trend we've seen, is that more and more people are wanting audiobooks than they used to. I think that you realise that it's actually much more fun to do your housework if you're listening to an audiobook, or when you're walking or running or travelling. People who often spend a lot of time in the car will listen to an audiobook while they're driving. So a few years ago, the perception was that audiobooks were for perhaps just older people who no longer were able to read, but now they're becoming a really popular thing with all sorts of ages.
And I guess it's a little bit tricky now, because you're not just buying books. You have to have a popular book in all 3 formats.
Yes. And audiobooks, electronic audiobooks. So there's 2 different types of audiobooks. You've got your ones on CD, which we have down in the library, which are the old-fashioned kind, and you need a CD player. But there's also the electronic audiobook. So, and a lot of people want that. They want to be able to listen to it on their phone when they're in the train or whatever. So it's not just the formats like you're saying. It's like you need a physical format on a CD, you need the electronic audiobook, you need the physical book plus the ebook. So we've got to try and cater for everybody, and that's a change as well, because if you go back 10 years, we would have just had physical books, and now we've got those 4 different types.
It's not, I'm going to air a bit of a gripe of my own now. It's not something I was aware of before I got my job here and talked to you about it, but you can't just buy one ebook and one audiobook and everyone gets it out. It's still, you buy each copy and it can only be out by one person.
Yes.
So it can be quite expensive.
Yes, absolutely. People do have the perception that multiple people can take out an ebook at once, but they're called one copy, one user. And it's exactly the same as a physical book. You buy one copy of an ebook, it can go out once at a time. And so you can put a hold on it and wait for it to come back. but you can't take it out if someone else has it out. Or we can buy 2 copies. It's the same thing if it's a very popular title. But yeah, so people are often surprised when they want to take out an ebook that they still may have to go on a waiting list.
Put a hold on it. Yeah. Well, I mean, hopefully some of that money's going to the author. That's always what I think.
Well, you can buy models where they can go out to several people at one time, but they're really, really expensive, and it's not something that, as a library, we can afford.
Yeah, and I guess for a larger library, that really makes sense.
So academic libraries with their textbooks would often, have that model. Because, a lot of their students will want it out at the same time, so they pay the extra. But as a public library, we're quite different.
Yeah. Oh, so we probably won't dive too deep into this, but I find it really interesting. But your team does the cataloging and adds metadata to our items. Can you give us a bit of a brief overview of what that involves and why it's important?
Well, we were talking before about even with the stack, but with ebooks as well. If people, sometimes their only access point to the library is through the catalogue, so it's really important that every book has good metadata so that people can find it. So that's our key, is that everything needs to be findable. So it's important that the data that we have in a catalogue record is accurate and there's no spelling mistakes. And we also have issues where we have to adhere to international standard, and we're not necessarily able to just introduce what we want to do locally, because most of our catalogue records are shared. And that's quite a complicated issue and probably confusing people, but your catalogue record is often sourced from an external site, and your own catalogue record might also be shared with other libraries. So you kind of have to adhere to standards, and it actually becomes quite a complex and technical issue.
Yeah. Oh man, I love that stuff. I don't know why. I'm sure some other people do, right, Gail?
Yeah. Lots of people love it. Yeah. So it's the same with our heritage records on Recollect. The metadata is really important if you're wanting a photo of Trentham School, but you may not necessarily be looking for Trentham School. You might be just looking for photos of school children in the 1960s. There's all sorts of information that needs to be captured in the metadata, so that if we have a really excellent photo from Trentham School in the 1960s, that people will find it.
Yeah.
So, can't underestimate metadata.
Yeah, and I think in general with things going digital, metadata is really important, because you can upload something, but if people can't find it, you're really just burying it.
That's
under
right, yes.
millions of other things. Actually, there's a good example of that again, before working here, I was confused by that kind of addresses, which is when I would search for a series on the catalogue, and then some of the books will be titled differently or come up differently in the catalogue. And that's definitely, so what's actually happening there is that that's a shared entry, right, between different libraries.
Yes.
And a library's got an issue 7 before the others, and it's used their naming kind of structure.
Yeah, so actually Upper Hutt is quite complicated here, because we belong to a consortium called Kortui that currently has 35 library systems throughout New Zealand belonging to it, and we all share the same catalogue, which is partly why I was talking before about our records are shared, and it's important that we stick to not only international standards but consortial standards. But yes, what you're saying is that, say, Tauranga get a book before us and they enter it a certain way, and it's not the same as the other books that we have in that series, we have got a bit of a problem. And we can't change the data that Tauranga have added, because that would really annoy them. So that's why, as much as possible, if we can all stick to a standard, then everybody's happy. But unfortunately, it's not quite as clean as that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's still the massive benefit. I mean, if it's already in there, we don't have to enter it.
That's right. Yeah. So if Tauranga have got it first, they've created a catalogue record. That's awesome for us, because that saves us having to spend staff time doing that. And all of the other 35 library systems can all share that same record. So that is one of the reasons why we belong to a consortium, is it saves staff time, and so it saves Upper Hutt ratepayer money, because we're all sharing the workload.
Yeah. just have to live with a couple of entries.
Yeah, you have to live with
different.
not being as perfect as it might be if we could create everything ourselves.
Still bothers me though. All right. So yeah, I mean, we won't go any more into that. If anybody has any questions, they can just post them in the comments or let us know.
Absolutely.
Now, not all of our listeners will know this. I mean, I call everyone here a librarian. It's what people expect, and it's fun. But I mean, I'm not a librarian. It takes a lot of study and work to become one. What is needed to be a librarian?
Actually, that's a really interesting point that you're just talking about there, because that is actually another change that I've seen in libraries over the years since I first started working in a library many years ago, is that it used to be purely it was library staff, but now libraries are a lot more interested in attracting staff like you, Simon, whose expertise is in marketing and communication, and we will have design staff and all sorts of people. So it's no longer just this narrow focus of a librarian, if you like. And in fact, it's more common now for people even to be called a librarian when they may not have any library qualifications. They might have a degree in history, but they're still having that expertise in doing research or working with the customer. So there's all sorts of things that are important to us as a library now that are quite different to what we would have been like 20 years ago. So, but yes, if you do want to go down the field, the line of becoming a librarian, yes, you do. There is librarian qualifications, and a lot of people are really surprised about that. They don't, they don't realise that you can actually do a master's degree in library studies, and a lot of libraries will require that if you want to go up to management level, but not all libraries. Yeah, it depends on where you are. So. But yes, if you're keen, don't feel that you, like I say, you don't have to have a library qualification to work in a library. You can bring other skill sets that are really valuable to us, and libraries love to have those people.
Good to know. Good for me.
Lots of ex-primary school teachers in libraries.
Yeah, true. Yes. So it's another question that we had. What would your perfect library look like if you had unlimited funds, Gail?
Well, I haven't actually been to see Turanga in Christchurch yet, but it sounds like that's pretty much your perfect library, over several levels with sewing suites and music suites, and it's just beautiful spaces where people can sit and just relax and read, because a library is so much more than books. I mean, I love the books, don't get me wrong, they're vital, and I could never imagine a library without books, but to have a library that has a lot of really lovely seating and beautiful outlook out the windows, and just a great place to go and hang out if you want to, and providing people who don't have a computer at home, even with the ability to use a computer and to be able to print out their stuff. That's all a really important part of a modern library, and
So I mean, I think I was pretty impressed by the Upper Hutt Library. I mean, I have been, it has been a nice place, but we are always fighting, especially with layout and stuff. I can always tell, where are we putting these books? We really want a seat there, we've got to put books. It's just
it's a real compromise, because we know that people do want a seat. They want to be able to sit down. And in the perfect library, you can grab a book off the shelf, not have to move too far away to find a seat and sit down and read it. So you want to not just have rows of shelves, you want to have a really attractive layout with seat intermingled amongst the shelves, and just a nice bright open place for people to be. And that's what we're always trying to achieve with our layout, is something that is welcoming and easy to use, and people can find what they're looking for.
Yeah, access to PowerPoints and where they sit and all stuff like that. Just definitely.
Yes, a perfect library has a nice meeting space that people can use. Yeah, but our library doesn't have that yet, but maybe one day.
Yeah. All right. So if you've got any other questions, do just let us know. Me or someone else or Gail will be happy to answer. Very lastly, You're quite a big reader, aren't you, Gail?
Yes, I've always been a big reader ever since I was about 6.
Yeah. So what kind of books do you read?
Well, I think my favourite type of book are probably mysteries, but I love action as well. So that's murder mysteries plus covert ops. I love Jack Reach and Lee Child books, but I also love fantasy and some science fiction. In fact, anything that's got a good story, as long as it's got a good story, I'll read it. But I guess the one thing I'm probably not so much into are not really into romances.
So you want to be gripped?
I want to be gripped. I like something that actually is a way of escaping from your real world and into a book, and it passes the time, and it relaxes you, and it's just an exciting way to spend some time. And I don't really understand people who hate reading. It's like, it's so much fun to read a book as long as it's a good story.
Yeah, awesome. All right, thanks so much, Gail.
Thanks you, Simon.
For letting me ambush you. Wasn't that bad, was it?
No.
All right, cool, thank you. I think that went pretty well, actually. I think ambushing my hapless colleagues and trapping them in here with me might be the way to do it in future. While we're still finding our feet with the podcast, we'd really appreciate any feedback you've got and any questions, what you liked and didn't like. And come join us next time to see who we chat to.